All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/Darwin Gross. That's DARWIN GROSSE. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to talk to someone that I've just met. His name's Kenneth Kirschner. He has got some really interesting stuff on his site. His site is KennethKirschner.com. You'll be able to get jump to a link to it on the show notes. It's really quite remarkable because it has got a complete body of work on it. Kenneth works in, he's often described as like working at the intersection of like modern classical music and electronic music. I think it's something a lot of my listeners will find interesting. And so I was really excited for the opportunity to learn more about it and also to share the info. So without any further ado, let's talk to Kenneth. Hey man, how's it going?
It's good. Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and joining me. This is really quite interesting. Could we start off by having you describe your work a little bit?
Wow, it's a hard question to start with.
Yeah.
What is it that I do? I'm reminded of a friend of mine who, whenever anyone asks him what he does, he says, "I make noises," which I think is perfect.
Yeah, right.
But I, maybe make something a little closer to traditional music. I'm kind of in a weird place because I'm sort of at the intersection, as you said, of a couple different things. I work in electronic music. I'm an 80s synth nerd is where I come from, and I'm used to working very technologically, but I'm also really interested in harmony and in these sort of traditional compositional questions. So a lot of that sort of bleeds into my work in the way it maybe doesn't for a lot of purely electronic people. So, my hero, as you can tell, who I spend all my time ripping off, is Morton Feldman. A lot of my stuff is very Feldman-esque. So I have an interest in these sort of somewhat dissonant approaches. And I do a lot of very longer form work.
Right. Well, having had a chance to listen to your work on your site, which is chock full of work, by the way. Thank you for that. It's really a beautiful thing because while I hear the Morton Feldman stuff, I also hear like a touch of satie, a variety of things, but also
Absolutely.
some stuff that is very much kind of like, I would say, after listening to a number of pieces, I also kind of identify what your voice is as well. And so it seems like you have a pretty deep well of compositional effort to draw from to have developed that kind of voice.
Well, as you can see from the website, I've been doing this for a long time. The website is a unique act of madness for anyone who hasn't seen it. I title all my pieces very abstractly by the date on which they're begun. And the website is literally just this, not endless, but very long, multi-decade chronology of every piece I've published. And so there's a lot there, and it moves. I like the fact that you can sort of hear the development. You kind of hear where I come from. You can go back to the late 1980s and hear what I was doing, and throughout the 90s, and follow the way I've explored different ideas. And I think there is a lot of diversity in it. Another thing I should say with the site is that I really emphasize that it's all available free, because I'm really, as a composer, I'm about taking risks, not just as a composer, but for listeners as well. And I want people to be able to go to my website, and it's conceptually intimidating, but you can click on something and there's no consequences. If you don't like it, try something else, delete it. It doesn't matter. You can kind of freely explore, and I'm always hopeful that people will do that.
Right on. Well, one of the things that actually really I found interesting, I came across your work actually through a link that was passed around via New Music USA. To a video where you kind of describe some of your work. And actually, as you were describing some of the work, I found a lot of resonance with the way that I think of work, but then also a lot of things that are almost polar opposite of what I feel. And one of the things I noticed that you talked a lot about is this concept of creating work where the recording is the thing, not some performance of it or not some score that will be performed in the future, but it's the recording that's the thing. And that seemed to be really key to the development of your work. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. I mean, when I started writing my own music as a teenager, I think for me, the point at which I really got excited about it was when I got a 4-track, this crude 80s 4-track. And I realized, like, instead of fighting with bands and playing and trying to get musicians to practice their parts, I could do this myself. And a lot of my whole musical development has been this desire for a real autonomy of being able to create recordings myself and also to publish them myself. So I can work as hard as I want. I can push myself as hard as I want to. I can have total freedom in what I'm doing artistically and build it all into a form that I am as close to happy with as I can be. And of course, there's a sort of an asymptotic process of pushing. You envision this perfection that you never reach, but I can go until I'm totally exhausted and can't take anymore. And then I say the piece is done and I get out there, which is actually going to be happening, I think, in the next week or so. I'm coming close to finishing a piece, which is about a 6-month long process for me at this point. So in the next week or two, I won't speak too soon, but hopefully in the next week or two, you'll see something new on my website. And so that's how it works.
That's really interesting. And one of the things you said earlier that actually surprised me is that you labeled these based on the date that they were begun. I think for a lot of people that do composition, it's like the ending date that's actually the stake in the ground. And the beginning date is sort of like such an abstract concept that a lot of people can't even point to, I started this on this date. It's almost like, well, it was kind of swirling around and then all of a sudden, I kind of belched it out in some way and it was done on this date. Why did you choose to label them by that starting date?
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to something in my process, which is that I'm not really envisioning these. There's a very interactive relationship with the technology involved that as I'm working. I'm not envisioning a piece. I'm not sketching it out in my mind. I'm working with raw materials. I'm someone who composes by ear. I'm sort of like the anti-Beethoven myth. Like if I went deaf, I would be done. Like there's nothing I could do. Because it's all based on hearing it. And, having worked my entire life as a musician sort of within the digital realm or the electronic realm, that feedback loop of hearing something, responding to it, changing it, modifying it, it's the fundamental component of my work process. And for that reason, the starting date is actually very essential because that's the moment where something gels, where something comes together. And sometimes I'll be envisioning sort of what I'm going to be doing, but usually there's this moment where something happens. You're like, that is the thing. I need to follow this idea. So the dates, along with being which is a longer story, just my way of avoiding responsibility for coming up with titles. I used to come up with titles and they were terrible. As a teenager, I would make these pretentious, awful titles for pieces. And I came to realize they were actually damaging the music.
Right.
And then I went through a period where I went to my piano teacher and I said, look, I gotta stop these horrible titles I'm creating. Give me some classical sounding things that don't mean anything. Like I had enough sense as a kid that a sonata is an actual form. Like you can't just say it's a sonata. But I said, give me anything, prelude or allegro, something that doesn't really mean anything concrete. And I did that for a while, and that was even worse. But what I was doing the whole time as I'm making these recordings on my little 80s 4-track is when I started recording, I write the date in which I started it, and then I figure I'm going to fill in the title later.
Sure.
And there was a point, and I was in college, I'm, maybe 19 or 20, where this idea kind of hits me, why don't I just not fill in a bad title? And there's a title right there already. And that's kind of how the whole thing got started.
That's actually pretty brilliant. And what's interesting is I can visualize the cassettes with the date on them, right?
Totally.
Little Maxell cassette with that little label on it. That's perfect.
Exactly. And then hopefully the crossed out, very pretentious title that I put in.
Yes, right. Well, I also can see where labeling things prelude or whatever, that would feel like it's boxing yourself in when you're really being super exploratory.
Well, exactly. That was always kind of my point of not making my original justification for not having titles. Was like, say, I call a piece, Ode to a Spring Morning, and you want to listen to it on a fall morning, like I've wrecked it.
Yeah.
Like I like giving the listener that freedom, and I like them to be able to develop a relationship with a piece of music that works for them in whatever way it's going to. And when people tell me about listening to my music and the strange experiences or visions or emotions or things they go through, I really enjoy hearing about that because it triggers very different things in very different people. And I don't want to lock that down by imposing my ideas. I really want you to get the pure abstract music and do with it what you will.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, one of the things I like doing in my podcast is learning more about people's background. And in your case, this kind of concept of like blurring the lines between classical music, but stuff you do on a 4-track plus 80s synth nerd stuff. I mean, it seems like a great... it seems like an intersection where the crashes are going to be spectacular, right?
I hope so.
I'd like to know a little bit more about your background. How did you get started in music? What was the things that drew you into both classical and electronics? And how did you become the artist that you are today?
Well, it was the 1970s when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I was, a kid in the Jersey suburbs, and, every household has a piano, and every parent says the kid's got to take piano lessons. And that's just the way things worked. And I was very obedient. My parents, who were not at all musical, said, you should take piano lessons. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And I hated it. I was miserable. I mean, I never practiced. I'd throw up before every recital. I was so anxious. The whole thing was a horrible experience, but I stuck with it because my parents said, stick with it. So I did, and it just never meant anything to me. I found classical music boring. I found pop music evil. I mean, I had no relationship to it. And, I just kind of wandered along. And I come from a very literary family, so it was a very cultural place, but they were not musical. That was not sort of the form of the arts that was present in my home life growing up. And when I was in middle school, about 12 years old, I went on a field trip for school, and I met this kid who had this thing called a synthesizer. Now, when I say synthesizer, this is 1982 maybe. It's a toy Casio. It's not a high-tech piece of technology. But to me, seeing this, it was like something had fallen back in time from the future. It was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. It could make all these kinds of sounds, drums and crazy. I thought this was just amazing. And suddenly, I was inspired and I was interested in this. And I fortunately had been slogging through these piano lessons all these years, so I had a little bit of background that I could kind of bring to bear on it. At the same time, I developed an interest in pop music, which is early 80s trashy synth, new wave synth pop. And also critically at the same time, I found a piano teacher who was willing not only to teach me the music I wanted to learn rather than force things upon me. He would teach me the music I was hearing on the radio, but he'd teach me how to learn it. He taught me how to listen and play by ear. And that was this, because I should say that I've realized over time I have a very bad relationship with notation. I got a kid now who's 9 years old, and he's taking piano, and he's honestly better at notation than I am. I mean, he sits there and he corrects me all the time as I'm trying to ostensibly teach him. I just have this block, like Western classical notation doesn't, at some deep level, make sense to me. And so I was kind of frozen out of music. It was not something I could penetrate to. But suddenly, here was a way I could learn to play by ear. I had these tools, these technologies that I could create music myself, and it changed everything. And by the time I was even 14, 15, 16 years old, I was saying, oh yeah, I'm going to be a composer. Like, that's what I'm going to do. Like, it's strange to me that most people aren't like that, but it was just completely clear that this is what I was going to do, and it's what I've done.
Right. Well, this difficulty with traditional notation, that's something that you and I share. Frankly, it was, I start off as a guitarist, and so guitar is typically a kind of hard instrument to deal with notation with anyway. Beyond that, the rhythms that I heard and then the way that they were notated, or chords the way that I imagined them and the way they were notated, there never seemed to be a match between what I would see and what I would hear in my head. It never made that connection.
It's a weird way to chop up time. Right. I remember what I used to do as a kid at these piano lessons. I was in elementary school, and I'd struggle with these rhythms I'm supposed to play. And I'd say to my teacher, oh, could you just play it for me? And I'd hover over his or her shoulder, and I would just perfectly match what they had just played. So clearly there was some musical ability there, but it just wasn't one that could make that translation. Right. And, so I became this really good mimic of just watching my teachers, and then I would pretend to read what was on the page, which is exactly what every teacher says you shouldn't do. But I was I was not a good student.
So you had this teacher that kind of taught you the process of learning. Is that where you started to get chops in terms of like learning theory and compositional development and stuff like that?
Yeah, that's where it got interesting to me because suddenly it was practical, you know. And of course, again, I'm a middle schooler in the 80s. I want to form a band with my idiot friends, and we're going to play at the dances. And it was a whole series of disasters. But that's what I wanted to do. You know, you have this ambition. I want to be, you know, Nick Rhodes from Duran Duran. I want to be, you know, whoever is, you know, on MTV at the moment. And so here was a way to get the skills to, like, I'd hit record on my boombox with the song I like came on the radio, and I'd take it to my piano lesson. I'd say, how do I learn to play this? And he'd say, oh, okay, well, you got to find the root, you got to find the chord changes. And, you know, that's where the theory actually started to be something that was of interest to me, because it was something that would get me to that imagined result of being popular in middle school or high school by having a band.
Yeah, popularity and synthesizers don't always mix, dude.
I just don't understand. Why is that? Why is that? What's wrong with this world?
I know, I hear you. So once you started getting a sense of structure and theory and that kind of stuff, how did you develop that into a compositional practice?
Well, that was really about that experimentation with the 4-track. So even as I'm struggling with bands and trying to get my friends to learn their parts, I've got this 4-track and I'm sort of saying, I could have 4 of me instead of me and my 3 friends. And I started to learn that iterative process of recording, of layering things. And I taught this all to myself. I mean, you didn't go to school for this. There was no way to do that then. So I just sat there with these tools and I kept asking my parents for weirder and weirder pieces of technology. They didn't know what they were, but they said, okay, you seem to need this thing, whatever it is. And I kind of just figured it out on my own. And from that, I really do feel like all of my compositional techniques I use nowadays are really rooted in that sense of developing recordings. That's, you know, kind of why the sense of creating a sculpture, creating a thing where the recording is the work itself. That's my process. That's the way I build these things. I think about how many copies of myself can I get? How can I perfect these different lines and control it all within this medium that kind of makes sense to me intuitively?
But at some point, you clearly stepped away from the world of synthy pop-like stuff and started embracing both some of the instrumentation, but also some of the voicing, I would say, of classical music.
Absolutely.
But also of kind of like abstract or avant-garde music. You took it far afield from where Duran Duran was going to set you up.
Oh, I don't think I've ever matched the work of Duran Duran. But no, I mean, I think what's interesting is that at the same time I was getting into pop music, my older brother was introduced to me to things like Philip Glass, and I was hearing stuff that, I mean, I think for me, hearing Philip Glass at a young age, that sort of defined what a composer could be. Like, it becomes more abstract, but you're kind of doing the same thing. I also, you know, could probably dig out from my cassette archives all these little pseudo Baroque pieces I was composing, you know, because I loved this stuff. I'd hear Bach, I'd hear different things, and I'd say, I want to imitate that. I want to do that. So that was in there. And there's always been this push and pull throughout my work, I think, between, you know, the acoustic sound sources and the electronic sound sources. And I love them both, but I kind of go back and forth. And certainly where I'm at right now is a lot of my stuff sounds very acoustic and sounds very traditionally instrumental, but it's all being built algorithmically with processes and data and all these weird ways that are very electronic.
Sure. Now, I assume you've graduated from the 4-track to a laptop or a computer with some large number of tools.
I actually got my first MIDI sequence. I started in electronic music right before MIDI was standardized. And when I was my senior year in high school, I got one of the earliest MIDI sequencers. And I did a theatrical score for it, for like the school play. And I used the computer, which then was, I remember I ran into this friend of mine at a high school reunion who was saying, like, you can't believe the things Ken was doing. He connected a keyboard to a computer. Like, nobody had done that before. Like, it's not that nobody had done that. Nobody had done that in our school before. But it was an interesting thing, you know, and I was, you know, already starting to transition to doing computer-based work in 88, 89, certainly. So it's, you know, if you worked in multi-track recording, it's a pretty seamless transition to moving into a DAW.
So true.
Same concept. Yeah.
Right. So most people that kind of end up doing the music that you do kind of go through a very traditional university process and all that kind of stuff. Did you do that, or did you just decide to do it on your own and
I decided to do it on my own. I was young and I was rebellious. I started out in college thinking I was going to study music, and I just hit a wall with it. I hated it. I mean, it's again, this is the late '80s, so I think academia is a lot more liberal nowadays. I think there's more interest in experimentation, but this was a very conservative time, and there was the sense like electronic music that's not something you do, and what we're here to do is to make you into a 12-tone composer, what I affectionately refer to as music to get tenure by, and it became and I have a lot of epic stories of battling my music professors and flipping over the table and saying, I'm going to write the way I want to. And they're kind of like, why are you here? And it finally occurred to me, I wasn't really meant to be there. I think there was this one fight with a professor where, we got into this argument about how I was, resolving certain chords in a piece of mine. And, we're getting mad at each other and I'm trying to be rebellious. He finally said, look, the reason I'm here is to teach you the historical way in which these things have been done. And I realized he was absolutely right. That's why he was there. And that's why I shouldn't be there, because that was just not what I wanted to do. And not long after that, I moved to New York City and I've been doing my own thing ever since. There's pros and cons to it, I can tell you, but it is definitely the path I've chosen.
Well, that's really interesting. I like the fight with the teachers. I mean, I'll never forget like having it out with the teacher one time about parallel fifths, and I was like, "Damn it, Black Sabbath does it all the time. Why can't I do it?"
Exactly. That was exactly the sort of fight I was having.
That's so hilarious. So then how did you sort of like kick off once you decide to break it out on your own? I mean, that's kind of a scary world, because if you don't have sort of the kind of safety net and safe nest that the university academic system provides, how do you go out there and say, well, I'm doing this forward-thinking, forward-sounding, neoclassical, neo-electronic music stuff? How do you do that when you don't have the trappings of academia around you?
You get a day job is what you do. And that was the first thing I did out of school was I got a job.
Right.
And I've had, to a lesser or greater extent, jobs ever since. I still have to work some as a freelance editor to support my music. And that's the part of the deal, and I certainly have a better lifestyle now. Like when I first started out, I had to work full time in an office, and it was a cool office. It was a molecular neurobiology lab. I survived throughout the 90s working for as the assistant to a famous neuroscientist. So it was a fascinating place to be. But, I was an administrator, and I've had menial jobs, throughout. And that's the price you pay. It's like if you want that freedom to really experiment and to really sort of, push the possibilities of what can be done and to really explore, you got to pay for the freedom. And that's how you get it. That doesn't change, I think. I look at my friends. I have many friends who work in academia now, and I feel like they have such a harder life than me. Grading papers and dealing with students and being on committees and teaching classes. Like, it's rough. And I feel like, I do a little bit of freelance work here and there in between music projects, and I get by. And it's not. I don't have tenure. I don't have that security. But it's a bargain I'm very happy with for the freedom and the time I get.
That's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about some of the process of making your music, because like you said, it's long form. It tends to have very much of an acoustic sound. So I'm kind of curious where those sounds are actually coming from. But also, you sort of mentioned that there was some algorithmic stuff built into this, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about, what is the process you go through. Because, you talk about like this long form thing, like it might be 6 months to develop a piece. I'd love to kind of hear a walkthrough of like, this is what it looks like. I gather here and I sift through here and I edit here. Tell me a little bit about that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll walk you through a sense of like the piece I'm building right now, which will hopefully be out very soon. Um, so, I start with, a general sense of, actually, this piece changed a lot now that I think about it. Well, a different general sense. There's always a push and pull between like what you want a piece to be and what it ends up being. But this one, as with most of them, starts out with a real simple improvisation. When I'm working nowadays, I work in these very constrained scales. I start with 4-note scales, often what I call a tetrachromatic scale. So just 4 adjacent semitones, which if you think about that gives you a very Feldman-esque sound.
Right.
And I just improvise over that, often with a couple different instruments. For example, splitting the keyboard between piano and a string sample, violin samples, cello samples, whatever I'm working with. So there's an initial sort of raw improvisation of just playing, which is, like the oldest thing ever. You just sit down, have fun. You improvise like that. There's great things that happen. And there's less great things that happen. So then for me, there's an early process of editing, of taking these are generally short, like 1 or 2 minute, 3 or 4 minute improvisations, just these little melodies, and sort of crafting them and honing them and finding what interesting ideas I might have stumbled across in improvising. And that, at least looking at the most recent piece, it forms a sort of almost like a fugal theme of the piece. Like that, there's a piece of raw material that begins the composition. The next stage is a sort of creation of variations on that through digital layering. So taking this underlying pattern, this underlying melody that I've built, and stretching it, transposing it, layering it against copies of itself, changing the pitch relations within the scales I'm using. And in all of this, what I would compare it most to, and this is where my process gets very electronic, it's like writing dance music. You sit there, you mess around with a bunch of loops, you get things going, and you're twisting dials. And in this case, the dials I'm twisting are generally pitch transpositions or changing the harmonic structure. But there is an improvisational process there of layering things together, exploding them in the computer, shooting these patterns at each other, and waiting for that moment for something interesting to happen. And when that interesting thing happens, you hit record. And so whatever software, whatever template I'm working in, I built it so that whatever crazy thing I've done, there's a moment where I can push one button and it's going to capture everything I'm doing. Sometimes that's in audio form. More recently, it's in MIDI form because I like having the ability to really micro-edit everything. So then there's this long period of improvisation with that earlier little theme I've created of just creating all these different variations of layering the thing and twisting it and stretching it and finding a bunch of different moments. Usually it's 30 or 40 or something, just these little short fragments. Each one will be 4 or 5 or 6 minutes long. They're usually a total mess. And then there's another process that goes on of selecting the best ones, of finding those that are the best, that can be put together into a story that makes sense, and then cleaning them up, editing them into something coherent. Then the technical process of making it sound like a good recording. And then hopefully next week it'll be published.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, but it sounds like a very organic process. Now, you made a brief statement that like you used to do audio, but now you're focusing on MIDI. But I'm wondering to what extent audio isn't the right way to capture it, because it kind of locks you into a step in the process and says, okay, now that step is there. Now I go to the next step.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I do find that it's helpful in my process to have those discrete steps, because otherwise I just end up bleeding through different stages or stopping. So I do find like, okay, I've written the underlying material, the theme of this piece. Now I'm moving on to the part of generating the material. Then I stop that, and then I go to the part of editing the material. That sounds very sort of procedurally helpful for me. But it's true that it's only very in the last few years, and there's a side story about an ongoing project of mine that explains how I've moved in this direction. But the MIDI has become more important for me as I'm focusing on more traditional instrumental sounds and on a particular way of writing I've been doing recently. That's exactly right. The MIDI gives you a flexibility that you don't have when you're locked into the audio. And that's something which I've learned in the last couple of years to really take advantage of compositionally, I think. Interesting,
because sometimes for me, having that stuff as MIDI actually complicates the process to the point that it stalls me out. It's almost like while something's still MIDI, it's too fungible for me to be able to say that's a piece that I'm working on. Right.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where my weird process helps me of having these distinct discrete stages I go through. And another thing that I've learned to do as I've perhaps gotten slightly better at this in terms of survive, you got to realize like the fatality rate for my pieces historically, I would burn 3 or 4 pieces for every one that gets, finished and published.
Okay.
I've gotten a little better at that. And I think part of that is sort of being willing to do tests and to like reach forward in the process and to say, okay, so what if I try this? Let me see if this is going to work, and running a few like preliminary studies and experiments and then ducking back a stage in the process. And there is for me always a point where I like lock a certain stage down and say, okay, I'm done generating new material. Now I've got to start editing it. But it does help to jump back and forth a little to make sure it's going to work, which is the hard part for getting any of these things to work.
Sure. Now, what I would say is that the process you're describing here seems to be almost as completely antagonistic towards collaboration as any process I've ever heard.
That is certainly true.
But I know that you did a release with Taylor Dupree at one point.
Yeah, Taylor and I have done a bunch of work together.
Yeah, I the one that I heard I really loved.
Yeah, which one was it,
Post Piano?
Post Piano, that's a series of records we did.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, Taylor and I have a particular process. Taylor and I have been friends for many years and have worked together a lot, although not as much recently. It's been a little while since we did something collaboratively. But we had a particular way of going about things, which I would say, which tried to take advantage of our respective idiosyncrasies and our ways of working. I think that's what you have to do in a collaboration. You kind of know, like, this is the part I'm going to be good at, and this is the part you're going to be good at, and we're going to go back and forth with this. I have another collaborative record coming out soon with a composer named Joseph Bransford. He and I have been working together for the last couple of years on a project that's been incredibly educational to me. And Joe heard my work a few years ago, and he felt like, and this is a crazy idea, and he suffered greatly for it, but he felt like he could adapt it for acoustic instruments. And we have been going through the process of sort of reverse engineering some of my work to be playable by acoustic musicians. So I'm going to have a record coming out, a collaborative album with him, which will have a piece by me and a piece by him. The piece by me is an originally electronic piece built from heavily manipulated samples that he madly and insanely managed to transcribe into this incredibly complex score, which I could not even count. I couldn't conduct it, much less play the piano parts in it, and adapted for piano and 2 cellos. And we did a performance of it, and last year we recorded it, and we've edited the recording. It sounds gorgeous. I'm really excited about it. And that's going to be out on a new label called Gray Fade that he started, and we're hoping to get that out in the next couple months. So it'll be a new direction in my work, but I think for me what's been most exciting is that has really impacted my compositional work, is starting to think in terms of maybe whatever piece I'm doing, maybe it's going to be one day we would be able to adapt it for acoustic instruments. So how does that change my thinking, and how does that, change how I go about writing these things? And that's been a really interesting challenge. And I think I've grown a lot from it, and I hope we'll continue this work.
Sure. Now, one of the things I would say is a lot of, I mentioned it before, I feel like a lot of your work sounds like it's acoustic, although you mentioned that a lot of your work actually is like you playing a keyboard with a split with piano and string sound or whatever. Yeah. I mean, is that always the case, or do you play other instruments? Or
I'm originally a pianist, so I think like a pianist. I was never very good, but that's kind of the perspective I have, which I think you can understand. It's like, as a guitarist, you think about things differently. If you're a wind instrument person, you just have a certain perspective on music and harmony and structure. But I mean, everything you're hearing on my website's electronic. I mean, that's not entirely true. There's cases where I've recorded acoustic musicians and processed their sounds. But the majority of stuff you're hearing is me working with samples, working with sample libraries, working with sounds that I'm manipulating in some way. And I take pride at times in the realism of it. I had a very respected colleague, write to me at some point, what string ensemble played that piece of yours? I'm like, that was me and my computer was the string ensemble.
Wow, see, that's what I would have come at you with is the same thing. Because I felt like what it sounded very much to me like was like processed string ensemble.
Yeah,
and so
there's cases where that's true, but I would say the majority of the stuff on my site is 100% electronic and just me. There's exceptions to that. There's times I've recorded acoustic musicians. Ironically, and this is, I think, an interesting case, is that when I recorded Conrad Harris from Flux Quartet, violinist, a few years back. Mm-hmm. And I had this whole idea of what the piece was going to be like. And I started to put it together. It completely failed, as every piece does. And I went in a totally different direction. And what's interesting is I found that the pieces where I'm working with actual instrumentalists end up sounding more electronic, whereas the pieces where I'm working with sample libraries sound more acoustic. So I think whatever you're hearing on my site, you should just assume it's the opposite of what you think it is. I mean, my piece, which is 100% violin, 100%. I have pieces that are 100% violin, 100% cello, 100% viola, 100% flute. They are the most electronic things on the website. They sound totally bizarre. And you'll hear something like, you'll say, oh, that's definitely strings, and it's totally fake.
Well, see, now, generally speaking on my podcast, I avoid gear talk for two reasons. One, because it's generally boring. And secondly, because it's so much of a date stamp, right? You'd be I use Native Instruments, blah, blah, blah. And 2 weeks later, you'll be something.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But I have to know a little more, because I'm blown away to hear that you're just using like sampling keyboardy kind of things for a lot of this work. Yeah. Do you mind me asking a little bit about what does your composition system look like?
Yeah, no, sir. I mean, it looks like the thing I'm talking to you on right now. It's my laptop. I have an external hard drive of sample libraries. I think I kind of realized this about myself fairly recently. Like, I always describe myself, as I've done here, as an 80s synth nerd, which is how I emotionally identify. But I'm really a sampler person. I'm not a synth person. I'm a sampler person. That was something I learned. I was maybe 16 or 17, and I went to a show at Princeton University, and the score was this guy who'd done something with an EMU Emax sampler, and I was so blown away by what you could do with this that was the next thing I got. And I've kind of been a sampler person ever since. And I think working with samplers for that long, it's like any instrument. You develop a feel for it. And I've learned to work with them in a way that I can hide their disadvantages cleverly, because there's a lot of disadvantages of working with samples. It's a dangerous thing. It can sound very fake. It can sound very mechanical. And I've learned to sort of weasel my way around that pretty effectively and write to what I have available technologically. So it's all my laptop. For a quick tech summary, I mean, it's nothing super exotic. I mean, I work in Ableton and Digital Performer. I compose in Ableton in terms of improvisational stuff. Mm-hmm. And then I edit in Digital Performer. A Performer was the sequencer I got back in 1988, 89, when it was before digital. It was just Performer.
Just Performer, right?
Which no one even remembers now, a long time ago. And I got a lot of plugins on that. I mean, it's, your basic, it's Native Instruments, Contact libraries, or libraries in general for whatever sampler, have come a long ways in recent history in terms of scripting, in terms of particularly like being able to get some of the nuance of acoustic instruments in the connection between notes in repetitions, which is always, of course, what samplers are worst at. I always would explain to people, like, Feldman, he plays the same note twice on a piano. It's not the same note. There's a physics in there of the resonance of the string. You can't play the same note twice on a violin because the hairs hit the metal of the wire in this complex microphysics that you can never capture. That's why acoustic instruments are wonderful. Samplers always showed that weakness, that you play the same note twice and you get the sampler effect. It's the same thing, right, obviously. Yeah. Like the mind, you hear it at some cognitive level. It's like it's not even an uncanny valley effect. It's a canny valley. Yeah, you're like, right. Wow, that's really fake. But I think it has reached that point where if you are really focused on the details and you have a facility with these tools, it's possible to create stuff that has a richness and organic quality to it. And to me, that's not about replacing the acoustic musicians. And I think, when this new piece of mine comes out with piano and two cello, you'd be like, wow, that's so much better than my electronic version. But for someone who's compelled to work in this medium, because I can't work in notation, I can't work with staff paper. The way I think is through thinking about patterns on the computer and modifying them and modulating things. This gives me a way to hear the sort of thing I'm envisioning and to really build it in a way that I'm, close to being happy with.
Well, and I would say that as no matter how stunning the piano and two cello sound is, there wouldn't have been that composition had you not had the sampling and computer tools
Exactly.
to formulate them in the first place.
Yeah, this is what allows me to be a composer, is having these tools and the adaptations. And it's funny because, having this power and these tools at your command, you become insanely neurotic, or maybe like me, you're that way already. But I got to tell you, editing the acoustic version of this piece almost killed me because, of course, you don't have that control anymore. And we may have takes of a given passage, but like I can't change the MIDI velocity values like the way I want to. I can't shift it a millisecond forward or backwards in time. And I came to learn that there's a compelling compromise that takes place. When you're translating these pieces back to acoustic musicians, that you get this richness and detail, and you've got to learn to live with those notes that are just a little out of tune or just don't hit quite where you want because you've given up that control you once had. Sure. It's been a good learning experience for me. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah. A lot of people who kind of like find sampling the compelling part of electronic music oftentimes at least gravitate somewhat towards like field recording or doing their own capturing. Have you experimented with that at all, or is that something that just isn't that interesting to you?
I went through a period of doing field recording works in the early 2000s, and you can dig those out on my site. Okay. It was a response to a very difficult period in my life, both personally and artistically, and I needed to start over in a sense and get back to first principles. And I was really struggling, and I found that by opening the window and sticking a microphone out it, I was able to get what I needed. And I ended up doing this whole series of pieces that were based on different neighborhoods of New York City, where I'd walk around with a concealed microphone and just capture the sounds. But rather than, I know a lot of people who are phonography people who take field recording as a sort of almost like a documentary filmmaking, which is very beautiful and a wonderful practice. But for me, it was a way of finding new raw material that could kind of work through what I needed to do musically at the time. So they became sort of the compositional colors in the palette that I was working with for a couple years. And it's very noisy and dirty and industrial and these very rough pieces. And you can dig it out on my website. And I hope that one is able to hear sort of the same, even though the sound design is very different, I hope sort of the same compositional concerns are sort of in there and recognizable. It's a period I have some ambivalence about.
Interesting.
There because I think it's important.
Well, your website is sort of like the endless scroll, so I'm just gonna have to keep on scrolling until I get to those early 2000s, right? In one sitting. Now, the other thing is you talk about having kind of come from the 4-track thing, and 4-tracks are making a comeback. Have you ever been tempted to just like get back, pull out the cassettes and start labeling cassettes again, or is that long and happily gone?
It's, I have a lot of friends who do a lot of cassette stuff nowadays, and they love it, and they swear by tape, and they get wonderful results. I have not been really tempted to go in that direction just because I kind of feel like my thinking is elsewhere. Like I'm really focused on harmony and these very abstract principles, and I feel like if I need to reground myself in sound design and in like the tactility of the medium, that might be a direction I go in. But I'm really happy with what I'm doing right now, and I feel like I got a little ways to go on this still.
Awesome. Well, Kenneth, I'm sorry, we're out of time, and I've got this whole list of questions I would still like to dive into, but we're going to have to save it for another time.
Yeah, this has really been part 2.
Yeah, let's do it. For people who want to hear more, first of all, it's KennethKirschner.com. That's the place to have the endless scroll of all your work from your whole lifetime, right?
Pretty well. I mean, there's a lot I haven't published that you don't want to hear.
Okay.
My recording is going back to 1982, and it's not pretty. So,
all right, and the work that you did with Taylor, what are some names for people to search on for that?
Yeah, I think Taylor and I have, 3 albums together. There's Post Piano, Post Piano 2, the cleverly named sequel, and then we have a live album called May, which was from a concert we did in Lisbon in, I think, 2008. And yeah, I think those are all pretty widely available.
Okay, fantastic. Well, man, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This was just a really inspiring and exciting discussion. I really appreciate it, man.
Super fun. Great talking to you. I really enjoyed it.
All right, likewise. And with that, I will let you have the rest of your evening. Have a good one.
All right, you too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Many thanks to Kenneth for having the great chat. It was really cool to hear about his process. Kind of insane if you ask me, because these are some long-term projects, but the result is really beautiful. Make sure that you get a chance to get over to KennethKirschner.com. You can find a link on the show notes if you need. But jump over there and take a peek. I think you'll really enjoy what you hear. Also for my Patreon subscribers, patrons, you can head over to patreon.com/DarwinGross. And for people who are on the second level or above, you will have an opportunity to actually hear an unreleased piece by Kenneth. He graced us with a little side bit for the patrons to be able to listen to. So a little side benefit there if you're into it. Otherwise, I want to thank you, the listeners, for sharing the word, spreading the word, getting other people to listen to it, and just generally making this a great community of listeners. I also want to thank all of the people. I want to thank the people that have reached out about the transcriptions, especially those who have offered some help. I'm working right now on putting together something where we can make some of the transcription work part of a community project. So if that's something you seem to be interested in, or you might be interested in, drop me a line, darwin.gross@gmail.com, ddg@cycling74.com, or ddg@20objects.com. Any of those will work. In the meantime, it's great to have you on board listening to these interviews, and I hope that you've enjoyed listening to them as much as I've enjoyed putting them out there. Catch you next time around. Bye.